or visit us at mpuptown.com. That's mpuptown.com.
Hey, this is Andy Otto, Executive Director of Twin Cities Pride and your host of Twin Cities Pride Amplified. Our community needs your help. Twin Cities Pride is collecting donations to help our local community in need. We're collecting everything from shelf-stable food, household cleaning supplies, infant care items, and personal care products at our Pride Cultural Arts Center. If you're looking to help, reach out to us at info@tcpride.org or just stop by 1201 Harmon Place in Minneapolis. It's our time to take care of our community and take care of each other all year long.
Get ready to zoom into a world full of color, música, and alegría at Children's Theater Company. Go Da Go, Ve Pero Ve is a bilingual musical bursting with playful, high-speed energy as dogs drive, swim, and race to the big dog party. This joyful espectáculo blends English y Espanol with expressive physical storytelling. Go Da Go is sure to have you laughing, moving, and howling with delight. On stage January 20th through February 22nd. Tickets at childrenstheater.org.
Portions of the following program may be pre-recorded. Good morning and welcome to Connections Radio Show, where we talk about ideas that matter. I'm glad you've made the connection and are with us today. I'm Lori Fitz, your host, and the goal of our show is to explore a wide range of topics that challenge us to see ourselves, our community, and the world around us that gets us thinking. And perhaps inspired or challenged to do just a bit more because we've made that connection. Our topic today is Black and Jewish communities and their interwoven history. And I want to do a big thanks to Kit Bix. She is our co-producer, and she has been producing shows with us for the Jewish Voices series. Thank you so much for all that you do, Kit.
Hi.
And Kit has just chosen to say hi. So a big thanks to you, Kit. And as we celebrate the Black History Month, we're taking the opportunity today to explore the PBS series Black and Jewish in America, an interwoven history with Henry Louis Gates Jr. Black and Jewish America is a 4-part series tracing the rich, complex relationship between Black and Jewish Americans, defined by solidarity and strained by division. Drawn together by discrimination, they forge civic and cultural bonds, especially during the Civil Rights era. The series explores both the challenges and the enduring promise. In this first segment of our Connections Radio Show, we'll be focusing on why the timing of the show is right or not, as it relates to our current day and the rise of white Christian nationalism. I have a wonderful co-host today, Cherie Curry. She is an award-winning journalist and founder of the forum blackandjewish.org. She's also the co-president of the National Association of Black Journalists in Minnesota. She has been a staff reporter at Fortune, an associate editor at Advertising Age. She's been a correspondent with People, the Wall Street Journal, as well as publications in Israel while she spent her time there. Welcome, Cherie, and I really appreciate you being a co-host today.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So tell me a little bit about the Black and Jewish alliances.
Yeah, and this is one of the reasons, too, I created the blackandjewish.org.com site more than 20 years ago. So there is, with the alliances, we have, it's on two sides, right? Mm-hmm. Because we don't want people to think that Jews are all white. There are also Jews of color. There are also Black Jews, very multicultural. And there's this history, which is why we have Dr. Uhuru here as well to speak about the history of how Blacks and Jews have worked together because of commonalities and with discrimination in this country. And at the same time, there became a period where
things
they didn't
strained.
work. Yeah, it was strained. And the PBS series that Uhuru was a guest on talks a little bit about both of those.
Well, I'm going to jump in and actually introduce Dr. Uhuru Williams. You are a distinguished university chair and professor of history and founding director of the Racial Justice Initiative at the University of St. Thomas. You are a frequent expert on the History Channel and PBS, including the 2026 PBS special, Black and Jewish in America, an Interwoven History.
Yes, thank you. It's an honor to be able to be here with Dr. Uhuru Williams as well. We are also colleagues. I appreciate your being here. And then in talking about this show to the Black and Jewish in America, and it starts off. It's has 4 episodes to it, and it starts off with the Seder table for the Jewish history with Jews of color around the table, along with non-Jews as well. Tell us a little bit, since you were featured as an expert on this show as well. How did you become involved in it? I think you know Dr. Henry Louis Gates Jr. You worked with him maybe before.
We've worked together before, but I actually don't know him. And I was a little surprised when I got the call for this particular project because, as an expert in African American history, I anticipated that when they wanted to talk about this, they wanted to talk about the fracture point. Typically, as a 20th century US scholar and as a scholar of the civil rights and Black Power movements, that conversation typically pivots around the moment in which the Black and Jewish alliance crumbles in the mid 1960s, late 1960s. So the way the arc typically goes is that you have a conversation that begins really with the formation of the NAACP and Jewish scholars and activists who are very active in terms of promoting that work.
And very
It reaches-
intentional.
Incredibly so. In fact, you have someone like W.E.B. Du Bois describing Joel Spangarn as both a scholar and a knight for his commitment to civil rights and racial justice for Black Americans. By the 1960s, it reaches its crescendo with the support of the civil rights movement by the Jewish community. But in the aftermath of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 in particular, and as that movement begins to move north, that complexity of that relationship reveals itself in ways that begin to reveal kind of fissures in that structure. And that's where I thought they were going to ask me to talk about. But in fact, Skip really wanted to explore the deep complexity and the deep relationship that these two communities have. So I loved being part of this because we don't often get a chance to talk about, at least I don't get a chance to talk about that.
So more of the celebration
Absolutely.
of the communities being able to find their joint intersections as
That
well as
interwoven history,
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah.
And we'll start a little bit too with a little bit more recent history than getting into the history that happened, decades ago. So Dr. Henry Louis Gates Jr. was saying he came up with the idea for this series after the 2017 Torchlit March in Charlottesville, where there were white supremacists who were using anti-Semitic and anti-Black rhetoric. And this was also in 2015, we had the mass shootings of Blacks in Charleston. There was also around that time, a year or so before, the shooting of Jews at the Tree of Life Synagogue. We continue to see a lot of there's data that shows that of race based hate crimes, Black people are the targets of the majority of that. Roughly 2/3 of religion-based hate crimes are targeted towards Jewish people. So 2015, 2017, this is not that long ago. What's going on today? And then how does the PBS series kind of help to shine a light on some of this?
I wasn't surprised to learn that about Skip and being influenced by that moment, because that moment was very jarring, I think, for a lot of people who are familiar with this history. And it was interesting that it took place in Charlotte, because here's a site Charlottesville, that we associate with the American Civil War. And Americans love to say, that's not who we are. But when we talk about anti-Semitism and racial prejudice, that's exactly who we are. And Charlottesville revealed it in a way that in this site, which we associate with the Civil War and Reconstruction, this moment where the nation seemingly overcame, or supposedly overcame, this impulse toward segregation, you ultimately had the revelation in a way that was unmistakable of the continuing strains of anti-Semitism and anti-Black racism in the United States, which were the cornerstone of white supremacist beliefs and foundations. There's a reason why the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s, the great civil organization or social organization it presented itself to be, is built on the foundations of anti-Black racism, anti-immigration, and anti-Semitism. So they have a long history and an interwoven history in that way. And when you heard those chants at Charlottesville, Jews will not replace us, it was linking both this celebration of Confederate monuments and Confederate history with this deep, ugly, anti-Semitism, which lives both in conjunction with anti-Black racism, but also has some distinctive elements which we often overlook in talking about that relationship between the two. As you said, Sheree, when we think about this in terms of the United States, the most visible is what happens in terms of anti-Black racism. And anti-Semitism, in a way, gets only revealed in moments where it's unmistakable. And yet that strain is here and visible, I think, to those who are looking for it in ways that are unmistakable as well. So Charlottesville was one of those moments for a lot of people where it was a reminder. There's a reason why these two communities have shared this history. There's a reason why we're drawn to each other. It's a reason our stories resonate. There's a reason that when we talk about the Freedom Summer of 1964 and Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman, that story still speaks to us. And there's a reason why Jewish activists, I think about Rita Schwerner in particular, when she takes that courageous step in 1964 of saying, look, my husband has been murdered, but when James Chaney's go missing, when Black people go missing, it's rarely. So kind of utilizing her privilege in that moment to draw attention to the treatment of Black Americans, but then at the same time, focus on the fact that Jewish people have often received that treatment as well. And that's where that sensitivity comes from. So Charlottesville, I think, was important for all of those reasons.
Charlottesville broke my heart because I actually went to the University of Virginia my first year. And it was in the 70s, and you kind of thought you were past all of that. And then to see your own school on the school grounds have that kind of chanting and that kind of hatred was a throwback to a time when people didn't say it out loud, and now they're saying it out loud.
I agree. I mean, and I think we're in a moment when the Trump administration in particular is giving people the permission to do that permissiveness. So we have devolved in a lot of ways. I was just speaking to someone about this the other day. This year marks the 100th anniversary of Black History Month. If we go back to 1976, when the U.S. is celebrating its bicentennial, you've got Gerald Ford saying to the American people, lean in and study Black history. And it's a pretty powerful pronouncement because what the president was doing in a moment when the nation is suffering from a malaise, a crisis of confidence, the humiliating defeat in Vietnam. He's saying, well, one of the things that we can celebrate is look how far we've come with regard to race relations. Here we are on the eve of the 250th, and we've actually moved backwards. And the litmus test for that, again, isn't only in terms of the treatment of Black Americans, it's also in overcoming this divisive impulse that we see in terms of the treatment of immigrants, and certainly in the anti-Semitism, which has accompanied that anti-immigration impulse in American history.
And we have those areas too where we're about when we look at, we had President Barack Obama, and people say, well, we haven't gone back, look at how much, we have achieved as a country, but there is still people do still see the anti-Black and the anti so many other groups, immigrants and so forth. So that's so interesting.
I love that you said that, Sheree, because there's people often talk about, or at least the administration talks about, Trump derangement syndrome. But one of the things that exposed kind of this deep, hidden white supremacist foundation, again, kind of exposed the structure, was the election of Barack Obama. That moment where the rise of the Tea Party, the kind of destruction of the Republican Party as we knew it, and the emergence of the MAGA, which is deeply racist, deeply anti-Semitic.
And continues to attack Obama.
Yes.
It's still on their radar.
It's almost like that's the Obama derangement syndrome.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, in looking at how both Blacks and Jews share a distinction of being primary targets of white nationalist ideology, how is the hate played out differently today? Do you see it?
It's such a great question because I think our communities are often pitted against each other. And we've certainly seen that in our contemporary moment. So rather than leaning into that shared history and the sensitivities that should come from two groups of people whose histories have been, in many ways, the script can be written through these ugly periods of pogroms or lynching, race riots. Often we're led to believe that we have less in common. In our contemporary moment, I think what worries me, and I think what really problematizes this for a lot of people, is this conflating of Israel with anti-Semitism here in the United States and how people react to kind of what they see as pro-Israeli stance without being able to be nuanced and understanding that you're talking about very different impulses, that not all Jews are Zionists, that Gaza is a issue as divisive as that was for some people. There are many Jewish people that spoke out and were opposed to what they saw as the same settler colonial impulse that led to the displacement of indigenous people in this country that was driven or by the same strain. At the same time, in the Black community, there is this latent anti-Semitism that people want to talk about. And sometimes it's not with regard to Black Americans, but those who've come from other countries who've had an experience with both Black Americans and Jews that kind of feeds that. And then last but not least, within the Black community itself, this fractured history, which I was very impressed that Skip got into in the documentary, around this notion that for the Black community, the Jews have often been the haves. So it's this impression that Jewish support of the Black community has been charitable rather than stemming from this kind of shared history of oppression. And we have to talk about the history of the Jewish people, and particularly here in the United States, as being a history that's steeped in oppression.
I'm so glad you brought up the Gaza and looking at what we are today. I want to make sure we get into that in the next segment. And this has been such a fabulous conversation. I'm excited about continuing that conversation. Want to let folks know as something to consider, Cherie Curry, my co-host today, is also the co-president of the National Association of Black Journalists Minnesota. Please consider making a gift to this organization. The website is nabjmn.org. Thank you for participating in our conversation, and we'll be continuing it shortly after a few short commercials.
Greg Bakken here. Like you, I love good, fresh, delicious food. So I want to tell you about this treasure in Roseville called Mavericks Real Roast Beef. Mavericks has the best roast beef sandwiches I've ever had, made fresh every order. Add fries or onion rings dropped in the fryer when ordered, and you have a winning combination. Mavericks Real Roast Beef has a lot more than roast beef, so check out their website, mavericksbeef.com, or check out their restaurant on Lexington in Roseville.
This is Chad, owner of AM 950. I've been telling you about my friends at Snap Construction, who are arguably the most well-reviewed exterior construction company in the metro. Don't just take my word for it. Take a look at all their reviews online. Winter is the most cost-effective time of the year to complete your construction project. A majority of Minnesotans choose to have their work completed on their home in the summer when they should be enjoying the weather. As a result, the demand for labor in the summer is much higher. The most cost-effective way to improve or restore your home is in the winter due to the lower demand. Right now, Snap Construction is offering an additional 30% off of labor to the AM 950 listeners on your next construction project between now and the end of February. Call 612-333-SNAP and mention AM 950 for an additional 30% off. As always, Snap Construction stands by their work with a lifetime craftsmanship warranty. Don't wait to get a free estimate by calling 612-333-SNAP or find them online at snapconstruction.com. Financing options available.
AM 950, the progressive voice of Minnesota.
Welcome back to Connections Radio Show. I'm Lori Fitz, your host. And this show is all about talking about ideas that matter. And I'm glad you've made the connection. Our topic today is Black and Jewish communities and the interwoven history. Again, thanks to Kit Bix. Our show today has been co-produced with her, and it's part of the whole Jewish Voices series. My co-host is Cherie Curry. She is an award-winning journalist and founder of the forum blackandjewish.org. She's also co-president of the National Association of Black Journalists Minnesota. Her articles have been published in USA Today, Entrepreneur, Star Tribune, and others. We also have Dr. Yehuda Williams. He's joining us. Dr. Williams is a distinguished university chair and professor of history, as well as founding director of the Racial Justice Initiative at the University of St. Thomas. And we're so grateful to have you here today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And I'm excited about this segment. With your background in history, you've brought so much insight and continuing to do that for us in this next segment.
Yeah, and you brought up also about the relationship and how Blacks with Gaza and Israel and versus, how Jews look at it. And you mentioned how not all Jews are Zionists. And then I have to also keep reminding, and not all Jews are white. And so and as Lori mentioned at the top of the show as well, I lived in Israel for a year. And as a Black Jewish person, and as well as for other Jews of color, that can be an interesting place to be, where you do have African Americans who are looking at how are the Israeli government, treating the Palestinians. And I saw some of that firsthand, living there. And that has kind of brought us to these other points of tension for, I'm going to say, white Jews in America and the Black Christian community. What are some of the points of tension as well?
There's so many, and I think it's important for people to recognize, as you just shared, Sheree, and I think the nuance that you bring to that conversation is very important, that ultimately this is the impulse whereby you lay at the feet of one individual or one administration, attempt to lay the sins of an entire community at the feet of the policies that are implemented by one administration or one person, so on and so forth. In terms of the Black Jewish experience in particular, when you note, for example, the fact that there are Blacks who practice the Jewish faith, when we think about the connectivity in that discourse, it's important for people then to be able to appreciate the complexity of that relationship. That the pushback against what we saw in Gaza, as Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote, where he says, I went to Israel and I feel that the Palestinians are treated in the same way that Black people were treated, also then requires us to think about, but what has been the history of Jewish people globally in terms of encountering similar prejudice, and not solely looking at it in the context of what's happening in Israel. It's bigger than that. And so I think sometimes people get caught up in wanting to make a case that totalizes the experience of everyone in relation to, and then utilizing, I think in a way that's very harmful, the experience of the Holocaust to then say, well, everyone should know better, or they should know better because of this experience. The exploitation impulse lives deeply within the human experience, and we all have a choice. We either embrace those stories which see our shared experience and our shared humanity as liberators, those who are lovers of liberty, who privilege human life and who work toward a beloved community that Dr. King envisioned, or those who are exploiters. And there are always going to be people who choose that. I choose to celebrate the history that positions us in terms of our shared humanity.
Thank you.
So as they stand today, we've got this onslaught. And we see in the past there's been housing issues and employment issues, and they're still relevant today. How do we navigate that?
We have to talk about it. I mean, I like to say that coming out of the optimism of the Civil War and Reconstruction, by the time we get to Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896, you have these 6 degrees of segregation which present themselves. And these are firm obstacles to not just full equality, but economic opportunity for Black Americans in housing, access to places of public accommodation, unfair labor practices, and the most intractable and visible of those 6 degrees of segregation, Jim Crow justice, the way that Blacks were treated by the criminal legal system. Jews as immigrants, and just because of anti-Semitism, navigate those same questions. However, their whiteness allows them in some circumstances to circumvent or to avoid the most visible consequences of that. It is the difference between an Alice Dunbar Nelson moving to Wilmington, Delaware in 1903 and not being able to pass, and then being aware of Jewish neighbors who were able to because their skin gave them the privilege of not being recognized or othered in that way, as long as they weren't practicing Jews or overt in the display of their Judaism. Having said that, we talked about just in the last question, in an exploitative society, in order for people to survive in a capitalistic structure, there are always going to be those who are going to be pitted against one another because they're competing for meager resources which exist in the written off space for the others. And that has been the history of Blacks and Jews in many ways, particularly in urban centers. So if we think about the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s, by the time we get to 1967 and you're talking about what's happening in Ocean Hill, Brownsville, New York, you have Black Americans saying, Well, our teachers are the Jews, right? These Jewish teachers who work in our schools, and they're part of the system that exploits us and denies us access to our history. Um, they have access to those jobs. They have access to opportunities that were denied us. Jews are not denied opportunity or access to the GI Bill, which is something that comes up in the documentary. And so that meant that access to housing, the ability then to transmit intergenerational wealth was something available to Jews that wasn't available to Blacks. At the same time, there are also stories within that. And I think the documentary does a good job of talking about this, where you have very principled people within the Jewish community who say, we recognize that. And so we're going to tackle that in the spaces where we have influence. And in the Black community, there's also this recognition that if we don't talk about this, and this is what's so important, what we get is a situation that we saw here in 2020 with George Floyd, where we forget that the tip of the spear is what happens in terms of George Floyd's treatment by those officers. The deeper questions is how people at 38th and Chicago have to survive in a system where that bodega on the corner overcharges for products and no one can explain why. Gas costs more in those communities, groceries cost more, so on and so forth. Jews historically have had to survive by being able to provide those goods and services in that system, exploited by the very same system, and then becoming the most visible, that you can kind of lash out and say, well, these are our enemies. But ultimately, the system is what's broken, and the system is what we have to reform. Those differences then, I think, would be minimized. But it's very easy to focus on what's in your face, as opposed to thinking about in a greater systemic way. How do we reimagine systems so that they don't grind people up and create those grievances or perpetuate those grievances?
And there's one too you brought up too with housing, for example, where the series talked about Levittown and created by someone who was Jewish, these tract housing, and yet Blacks were still excluded from them. It was at a time, though, where we still had the redlining. You know, there was a time in history, too, where Jews were excluded from certain housing. Blacks were excluded from certain housing. But because of, you said, the whiteness of predominant Jewish culture, they were able to go in and, you know, create systems for housing for themselves. But at the same time, I think my interpretation is it was going to still be difficult for them to sell houses to Black people because that was the America that we were living in at the time. And then you get this period where we talk about as Black people do move into a neighborhood and white flight, they're moving out, and you have Jews who end up being some of the ones who also were renting or selling homes too, but let's say the renting. And then they're looked at, well, okay, are they also becoming the oppressor? Because now I have a landlord that, you know, are they charging me too much rent? There's so much history that crosses in different ways.
And they probably were, because that's the exploitative nature of capitalism as it functions perpetuates that, I think, in ways that then Jews unfairly are targeted as those people who are perpetuating a system which they inherit. And as you pointed out, Cherie, are victimized by redlining and exclusion in terms of the restrictive covenants. And then much later on, try to create communities. In some sense, as a defensive mechanism, you could see, but then also leaning into the notion of whiteness as property. And we don't want to talk about that often in this discourse, but it's important. Whiteness is a currency. And so when you have Levittown, the idea is that if this is going to be an inclusive space, what is the definition of exclusivity in the United States? It means that these people can't come, right? They're excluded. And that was the model and the blueprint in the 1940s. It's the model and the blueprint today, that exclusivity, the fact that I live in a gated community. And what does that mean? When I erect that gate, it means that the people who live on this side of the gate, the people that I'm trying to keep out, don't have the finances, don't have the intelligence, don't have the culture that I have. So you're selling that illusion, you're selling that dream. And then when it becomes available to Black Americans, it's at a premium. The joke that I like to tell, which is not funny, is if we think about a show like The Jeffersons from the 1970s, to move on up and to move on out means, in some sense, to have to leave behind not just where you came from, but any notion that what you came from could ever produce anything that would be worthy of living on the other side of that gate.
And it becomes an assimilation.
Absolutely.
What strikes me in looking at the challenges between the Blacks and Jewish communities is that the system benefits from the anger. It benefits because if you have two communities fighting each other, they're not questioning into the system. They're not questioning into the people in power. They're not going, wait a minute, who's really the challenge here? And what do we need to look in a broader way versus us versus them? What is the us that can be created and question into for how we want to be as a country, as a democracy, as a people that welcome immigrants, as a people that welcome all. I mean, we're the only country that was founded on an idea.
Couldn't agree more. And yet I think at our 250th, the fundamental question today is this problem that has been raised by the Trump administration. Marco Rubio today gives a speech in which they are promoting this idea that we're Western democracies, Europe and America, founded on a principle of white supremacy. So were we a nation that was founded on white Christian nationalism? Or were we a nation, as you said, founded on ideas? And this is important because if it's an idea or ideas, we're talking about a civil theology. And one of the key components of that civil theology is the idea that diversity is a strength, that immigration has benefited this republic, that those who've built it, although excluded, have been integral to its construction.
And we've asked them to come. Give me your poor. Give me your.
Absolutely.
They've said, please come to our country to build us up because we want to be a multicultural country.
Love that, but always with the paradox, because we think about the Statue of Liberty in particular. It's sent by the French to the United States in the 1880s to celebrate emancipation. But by the time it comes, the U.S. has already walked away from its commitment to Black Americans. So it has to be repurposed to celebrate immigration. And what are we doing in our contemporary moment but walking away from that commitment? Not the first time we've done it. You have this pushback against German Jews in the 1880s, which is expressed in some of the ugliest political cartoons that from that period. And they're all about what will the Jews bring to this country? Sabbath desecration, poverty, disease. Ludicrous, because it denies, again, the rich traditions, customs, the innovation, the skill, the knowledge that those immigrants brought that contributed in the same way the Chinese and various other groups contributed. So I think, again, it's interesting when we get into this and we kind of talk about that. We are really dealing with this question. Are we going to live up to the civil theology, or are we going to buy into Trump's vision and do something that, is something very different, very ugly?
And there were so many groups too. So outside of the Jews, we talk about the immigrants coming in, Italians coming in to at some point also were discriminated against. You could take any kind of group.
Us Irish.
Yeah. So it is interesting how we cannot still come together today as a whole, because all of our cultures at some point, the majority of our cultures, face some type of discrimination in this country. So why do we continue to perpetuate that against each other now?
We play a little bit of a competitive Olympics game in terms of oppression. And I think Congressman John Lewis probably asked the question in a way that authentically we need to ask it today. It's important for us, for example, it's a great example of Sri with the Italians, single largest group of immigrants subjected to lynching as a form of violence, where single largest lynching of non-African Americans is 11 Italians at the Port of New Orleans in 1891. But those individuals have a government that can speak up for them and say, you've killed our citizens. And once they determine that they're not Italian citizens, but citizens of the United States, they're like, oh, it's your problem. The reason I bring that up, though, is that it goes back to your point. We won't conquer that issue until we really deal with the group who has been the most marginalized, the most exploited. And so it means looking at that history and celebrating those connections, but then also saying, if we're going to fix any of these problems, we've got to look at the group that's been the foundations for them. And that's been Black Americans. So I think one of the things that we celebrate about, for example, the NAACP, Joel Spingiron, many of the prominent Jews who were active in the civil rights movement, they understood that. And they were saying, we understand that what produced the Holocaust in Nazi Germany is the same germ that produced segregation, inequality, that fed racism, that led to the dispossession of the lands of indigenous people here. And we want to conquer that. We want to conquer that the same way we conquered polio. It is a disease, and ultimately it will kill the body politic if it's allowed to flourish.
And I'm going to leave it on that note. with our next segment looking at what's the hope for tomorrow and what can we do and what can we build together. But before we go, I want to make a mention that Cherie Curry is the co-host today. She is also co-president of the National Association of Black Journalists in Minnesota. And I want you to consider making a gift to this organization. The website is nabjmn.org. The National Association of Black Journalists Minnesota is dedicated to advocating for the representation of Black journalists in Minnesota. As an organization, they strive to improve media coverage of the Black community and support aspiring journalists through mentorship, scholarship, and other resources. Again, please consider making a gift to this important organization. And again, the website is nabjmn.org. We'll be right back.
Are you planning a gathering for your family, friends, or work? Then reserve space at the Park Tavern. The Park Tavern offers private and semi-private spaces, and they can accommodate any size party, large or small. They have bowling, food, and beverage packages for any budget. And remember, there are no room fees and no minimum spending requirements. And for more information or to schedule an event, call 952-929-6810 or go to parktavern.net. Make your next get-together the best get-together with help from the Park Tavern.
AM 950 would like to thank everyone who joined and donated during our winter membership drive. Your support shows that Minnesotans still value an independent progressive radio station that delivers facts, not spin. AM 950 is locally owned, based right here in the Twin Cities, and dedicated to uplifting small businesses and diverse communities. At a time when some voices are being pushed aside, AM 950 refuses to be silenced. Please help keep progressive radio on the air. Visit am950radio.com and donate today.
Hey, it's Patrick for Zero Res. February is the month for love, so when was the last time you gave your carpet the love and attention it deserves? Maybe you've been procrastinating on the holiday post-mortem cleanup at your house. Are you worried if you got down on your hands and knees what you might see or smell? Not only is your carpet one of the biggest investments in your home, but it's also the largest air filter in your home. And what's worse, you're going to be stuck inside breathing this nasty stuff for months. Lucky for you, Zero Res is going to spread the love to you and your home. This month, get 3 rooms of carpet clean starting at just $119 and take $75 off your air duct cleaning. Call my friends at Zero Res right now, 952-ZERO-RES, or go online to ZeroResMinnesota.com and say you want the AM 950 special. A 4.9 rating on Google reviews and over 21,000 satisfied customers can't be wrong. Backward or forward spells the same. Zero Res.
Welcome back to Connections Radio Show. I'm Lori Fitz, your host, and we have been having such an engaging conversation about Black and Jewish communities and our interwoven histories amongst these strong communities. My co-host today has been Cherie Curry. Cherie is an award-winning journalist and a founder of the Forum of blackandjewish.org. She is also co-president of the National Association of Black Journalists Minnesota. In 2025, she was named Minneapolis-St. Paul Business Journal Women in Business. So glad to have you here, and thank you for your co-hosting. We also have our esteemed guest who's given us history and context to consider, Dr. Uhuru Williams. He is a distinguished university chair and professor of history and founding director of the Racial Justice Initiative at the University of St. Thomas. And delighted to have you both. With our discussion today, I'd love to wrap up with learning from both of you. What does the future look like for Black and Jewish communities, or what do you hope it will look like?
Okay. One thing that comes to my mind is going back to that when I created the forum for Black and Jewish, which was around the time my first son was born. And I'll just say the future looks like my children. It looks like so many other people's children with the rise of multiracial Jews, not just Black Jews, right? But Latino Jews, Asian Jews. We've always existed, but there's a growing number. And so I like to hope there's more of an understanding among the white Jewish community as well about the richness that Jews of color bring to the tribe, as we call the Jewish community, the tribe. And so that's my hope. and that if we, as two groups, since this is about blacks and Jews, that those two groups, as white Jews and black Jews, kind of see that we can also kind of stand as an example for the rest of America, as can so many other multiracial communities.
And you've also led other group discussions about multicultural Jewish and how important that is to look at the so many different cultures. And you've led them at your synagogue.
There have been so many different groups. So panel discussions from my synagogue, Adath Yeshurun congregation in Minnetonka. But also on a national level, I have been a panelist or a moderator on those discussions. A shout out also to Behol Lashon out of San Francisco, which has made a speaker in 2005. And since then, so there are a lot of organizations who celebrate us as a multicultural Jewish community.
And Dr. Williams, what do you see?
It's such a great question. And I appreciate Cherie's work in particular because I had an opportunity, the privilege of working with Randy Roth at Interfaith Action St. Paul when she was the executive director there. And one of the things I loved about Randy is we'd have these great conversations rooted in our histories, right? Anchored in our histories and that shared experience. I'm going to go back to John Lewis for just a second. In 2020, he wrote that final letter to the American people, which people always quote. And love the quote where he says, we need to get into good trouble, necessary trouble. I always say people didn't read the whole thing. He says, ordinary people with extraordinary vision have the power to redeem the soul of America by getting in good trouble, necessary trouble. And then he says, the way that we develop that extraordinary vision is through the study of history, our shared histories, not just the history of the United States, not just the history of Black Americans, but the history of every person in a way that we can authentically engage with one another. And through that understanding, build coalitions that can break down the barriers to equality that have chained us for so long. I think about as we're, in the midst of the Olympics now, Suni Lee winning a gold medal for the United States and then immediately saying, as a Hmong American, I'm disappointed that so few people know anything about my history. And I'm not an immigrant. I've been here. We've made this contribution. Don't celebrate me as a Hmong American that's won. Celebrate me as an American that won a medal and that my Hmong ancestry is central to my identity. And the fact that you don't know means that you're at a deficit. People who want to be colorblind are problematic because they see everything in black and white. I want people to see in the rich, colorful tapestry of our shared humanity, but then also our oppression. The last thing I'll say is that I think about 1986 and the picture of the Challenger. When most people think about the Challenger, they think about the disaster because, well, the Challenger came down, and so why are you talking about that? You go back and look at that picture from 1986 and that crew. Ellison Onizuka is on that, Japanese American. You've got Ronald McNair, the descendant of sharecroppers and slaves. You've also got two women, Krista McAuliffe, the teacher in space, but Judith Resnick, who is the fourth woman in space and a Ukrainian Jew. Mm-hmm. You can only celebrate the Challenger moment as a moment of celebration by looking at the history of each and every one of those crew members who then ultimately contribute something to that mission. It is not a tragedy at all. It's a triumph of multiculturalism. It's a triumph of America in spite of all the obstacles that those individuals had to go through to be a part of that mission. And yet at the end, they came together to do something that was in the service of a nation. I love Judith Resnick's story in particular because as a Ukrainian Jew, it forces people to contend with the anti-Semitism that animated the artwork of Dr. Seuss. It forces, in looking at Ellison Onizuka, to talk about the Japanese internment, and looking at Ronald McNair to talk about the treatment of Black Americans. And the other crew members who get dismissed as the three white guys, actually all of them talked about, or at least two of them, leaned into their immigrant background. That's what John Lewis meant in terms of really interrogating history as a means to develop extraordinary vision and go, hey, what we need to challenge and overcome is racial inequality, a denial of access to housing, gender discrimination, bias. And that really links to what Carter Woodson said in 1926 when he started Black History Week, Negro History Week. He says, what we need is not a history of the Negro or undue eulogy for the Negro. We need history taught without bias. That will create understanding. And until it's taught without bias, we have to elevate the experiences of those who we don't know in order to correct the record, to allow us the vision to understand what we need to change.
And I know I think about this too from what you're saying. When people say I don't see color, and to me, you also have to see the color, but without the bias. You have to see me for all of who I am. As a Black American, as a Jewish person, this is part of who I bring. As a journalist, this is who I bring to the table. So yeah, celebrate the richness of us.
And do the work that Kit, I love the conversations. We just have to sit in the discomfort. And Sheree, one of the things that I appreciate about your work in particular, if people aren't, you can't grow unless you're uncomfortable. Growth comes from discomfort. I spend a lot of time in the gym. I wish I'd known this, 50 years ago. I'd probably be a lot fitter. But the reality is that, you grow from pushing yourself in a little bit of pain. But what comes on the other end of that is actually the beauty of growth and the knowledge of what it takes in order to get to that place where you actually grow. And that is sitting in the discomfort.
When you mentioned the quote, what struck me also was ordinary. How ordinary. And I look at what is happening in Minneapolis today, the gathering of forces of the ordinary to do extraordinary work and to love thy neighbor. And what does that look like? I mean, could this be some of the roots of what we could look to in the future, of being able to question the system and to be able to find our similarities, to find the love for each other and the care for each other?
What I appreciate and what I hope will be the story of Minneapolis is exactly what John Lewis argued at the end of that article in 2020, that one day a generation will tell the story about this generation that picked up took on the responsibility and finished the work. If I think about our community over the last 5 years, from George Floyd to today, what a powerful story about a community that in 2020 refused to close its eyes to the police brutality that claimed the life of one man. And then 5 years later, you have this active pushback against individuals who are trying to rob an entire community, Somali, of their identity. It's not just about the sacrifice of an Alex Preddy or a Renee Nicole Good. It's about an entire community that was willing to say, we disagree. Our values are around this civil theology. We believe in inclusivity. We celebrate multiculturalism as a strength. And we're willing to even shed blood and deny and be uncomfortable in a way to affirm those values. So I'm looking, again, very rarely do you hear a historian say this, but I'm looking for it because I don't want to speed up my life either. 30 years from now, I think when you tell the story of Minneapolis, if the story were to stop here, it'll be one that affirms the best of what we believe, of what we can be as a community when we embrace those values.
And I'll say my one line to end with the Nation magazine nominated the city of Minneapolis and the residents, I'm going to say of the Twin Cities. It's also St. Paul, nominated them for the 2026 Nobel Peace Prize. We'll see what happens, but that speaks a lot to just also how the nation is also viewing our town.
I'm also cautious about sort of making this like, well, now we've pushed ICE out. And so, we've done our job. And I think our job and our history will show that we didn't stop here and that we have a lot to go.
That's the key.
Yeah.
Americans love a tragedy with a happy ending. Unlike the Russians who like, long tomes where the hero is poorly rewarded.
Chekhov.
Americans want everything wrapped up in 30 minutes or less with commercials. This isn't that moment. It's going to take a deeper commitment beyond this moment. And I think that's what happened with Floyd, ironically. Mm-hmm. There was a pushback when Mayor Fry said, George Floyd came to Minneapolis to better a city, but ultimately our city will have been better because of his sacrifice. And people said, no, we're not done. People like Nikema Levy Armstrong. In our contemporary moment, those same people are showing up like Nikema Levy Armstrong and saying, you will not target the vulnerable in our community. They're our neighbors. But that work has to continue. That kind of organizational push for equality has to continue. And I love that our communities, Blacks and Jews, are the model for how to do that. And that's why this history is so important.
It frightens me at times that the history is being squashed in many states, and that there is a desire to just literally whitewash the history to create just the white happy story. I want a happy ending, not in 30 minutes, but but my happy ending would be the commitment to the civic and the civil theology that you talk about, and being able to see beyond, because there's going to be some tough times, even in looking at that hope and that joy and that opportunity, we're going to have to go through a lot of slogging. And I think my disappointment in where we are today is I really thought we were further along. I mean, I really did. My mom was very active in civil rights. She was pregnant with me when she was walking children in Alabama. We made sandwiches for the Walk on Washington at churches, and we had folks come and pick up the food to take it down to the March on Washington because they had to eat, and churches provided the food. She led desegregation efforts in a John Birch Society, Pasadena. Tough stuff, horrible stuff. But you think that you get to the point. It's 1976 was the year before I graduated. So going on to the University of Virginia, I had that hope that we were celebrating Black history, that we believed in that being our history.
Right. Black history. I was going to say that Black history is our history. And my mother was born in 1947, grew up with separate water fountains in Alabama. They migrated to Chicago when she was 15. So how schools were segregated. My mother went on to get her doctorate in education, something that my grandmother never would have quite foreseen was going to happen, for her children. Hope. But yes, but this is American history.
It is American history. And I when you were talking about the difference between maybe even going into a hotel, white people go in the front door, but there was a back door. Restaurants, there was the front door for everyone, and there was the back door and the back area. And I remember as a kid going, what's going on? Why do we, and my mom telling us, we'll talk about this afterwards.
I do think we did learn something, Lori. I love what you said. And this is what we really have to double down on, is that I love that there is a generation of young people in concert with those of us who remember and those echoes, that I don't want that to be the experience for trans people to feel that there are barriers that exist that are immovable.
Right.
I don't want those in my community, Somali, Venezuelan, Haitians, to have the moniker that the president attached to their countries to be the way that they think that I think about them, because we know intimately that history. We carry that responsibility forward to practice in a way. It's interesting for me to quote her, but Sandra Day O'Connor was famous for saying democracy is a practice. What I love about that is that a practice is not perfect. I tell my first year law students that lawyers practice the law and doctors practice medicine. Otherwise, we'd only have to go to the doctors once. So practice means every day we have to get up and we have to do the work. The work never ends. And so when you talked about your mom preparing those sandwiches for the March on Washington, and my colleague Michael and I long and I wrote a book, the Radical March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, More Than a Dream. What I love about that story is, and we're still trying to find ways to feed the vulnerable and those who do the work as caretakers of our democratic republic, not for what it is, but for what it aspires to be. So we are the workers, the drivers, the spirit behind it.
The ordinary that can do the extraordinary together. And I love that we're being recognized as a city or cities that looks at the National Peace Prize. It looks at what's the opportunity for a greater peace internationally. What could that look like? My technical producer is letting me know that we only have 1 minute. So I want to make sure that I give you both an opportunity to have any closing statement that you'd like to make before we need to wrap up.
I just want to thank you so much for having us both on and to celebrate Black History Month in this way, the 100th anniversary of Black History Month, and just to remember that it is everyone's history. It's not just for Black people.
It's our history.
I couldn't agree more. And I would simply say, please continue to support to your listeners, public radio, public television, channels for information that are becoming less available.
And AM 950, the progressive voice of Minnesota. We're so glad to have you all. And again, thank you to Kit for your work in helping to support this vision and this the Jewish Voices series. And stay with us for next week. We'll have another great show, and we'll look forward to having you make the connection.
Greg Bakken here. If you're craving something delicious, Eat Local Minnesota is here to spotlight amazing Local places you're going to want to try right away. Step back in time and experience classic nightlife at Crooner Supper Club. 4-star drinks and entertainment all in one place. Enjoy incredible performance.
Swim and race to the big dog party. This
Portions of the following.
moving and
Recorded.
that kind of organizational story is, and we're still trying to find way. Please continue to support to your listeners, public radio,
Voices series. And stay with us for next week. We'll have another great show, and we'll look forward to having you make the connection.
Greg Bakken here. If you're craving some
Thank you for participating in our conversation, and we'll be continuing it shortly after a few short commercials. Thank folks know as something to consider, Cherie Curry, my co. Thank you for participating in our conversation, and we'll be continuing it shortly after a few short commercials.
Black American, as a Jewish person,
of what we believe of
ICE out and
America, in spite of all the obstacles that those individuals had to go through to be a part of that mission. And yet, at the end, they came together to do something that was in the service of a
private and semi.
we'll be right back.
And for
February is the month for love, so when was the last time you gave your carpet the love and attention it deserves? Maybe you've been procrastinating on the holiday post-mortem cleanup at your house. Are you worried if you got down on your hands and knees what you might see or smell? Not only is your carpet one of the biggest investments in your home, but it's also the largest air filter in your home. And what's worse, you're going to be stuck inside breathing this nasty stuff for months. Lucky for you, Zero Res is going to spread the love to you and your home. This month, get 3 rooms of carpet clean starting at just $119 and take $75 off your air duct cleaning. Call my friends at Zero Res right now, 9520 Res, or go online to Zero Res.